training, politics and history, and our guest's work. So now the real introduction can take place to our speaker today, our guest today, Oliver Hart, alumnus of the college and distinguished alumnus of the college. If I could just briefly summarize your career, Oliver, would you give me the liberty to do that? Growing up in London, you did a maths bachelor's degree in Cambridge from 66 to 69. Then you switched to economics through Warwick, Princeton for your doctorate. You came back to Cambridge for a lectureship in the Faculty of Economics and Politics, and you were a fellow of Churchill in the late 70s. And you have since held chairs at LSE, MIT, and for some time now, Harvard. I can describe you as the main progenitor of the theory of incomplete contracts, working especially with distinguished economists Sandy Grossman, John Moore, Bengt Holmström, and Ernst Fehr. And last year, winner of the Swedish Royal Bank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel, what we economists call the Nobel Prize, jointly with Bengt Holmström. And let me honour an absent guest whose excuse is that he lives in Australia, Jeff Harcourt, who we would like to have seen here. Jeff declined warmly, saying Oliver is one of the few Nobel Prize recipients who has lived up to the request to make his Nobel Prize article understandable to the general reader. The format of this session will be a 15-minute interlocution where I will discuss with Oliver, and mostly prod him to discuss, and then 10 to 15 minutes for questions and comments from the floor. Our audience is a mixed group, all highly intelligent, but of mixed disciplines, ages, and interests. So we will try not to be highly technical. So let me start the ball rolling by asking Oliver, your work has been in incomplete contracts theory, but to understand that, perhaps we need to pedal backwards a little and ask, what is contracts theory in economics? And would it be reasonable to say that when you and I were young, it didn't exist?
Yeah, I think that is reasonable. And it's certainly, my own work started off being about markets, general equilibrium theory, and that, I mean, much of economics is about markets and how well markets work, and some situations where they don't. And then, of course, but then there have been other strands, ideas that have become important, like games, strategic situations, so where you have small numbers. It could be two firms, or it could be just a small number of people who interact strategically, and it's not a market setting, and that's many people here will know that game theory has been tremendously influential and provided a way to analyze those situations. But contract theory is about situations where you also have small numbers, but people also can design the game. So typically in game theory, we take the game as given, but in contract theory we ask how you and I are in some economic relationship. We could be talking here about two firms, or it could be a firm and a worker, or it could be I'm borrowing money from you, and that could start off as a market transaction, because let's say if I want to borrow money, I could perhaps borrow from any one of you here, but once one of you has agreed to do it, then it's going to be a one-on-one situation. Am I going to repay you? And so the question is, how can we design things so that I have an incentive to repay you, which is what is going to give you an incentive to advance the money. Let me just say, I mean, it's somewhat confusingly, there's another area of economics which also deals with this, which is called mechanism design theory. But that's a bit more abstract than contract theory. So contract theory has arisen, I think, partly because everywhere you look, actually, in the economic sphere, but also in other spheres, you see contracts. I mentioned borrowers and lenders, but when you take insurance, that's a contract. when you rent a house, that's a contract. Firms that, if I need some input from you over many years, we're going to have a contract. So there are contracts all over the place, but studying them has been sort of the province of lawyers, really, until relatively recently. And so you're right, it's since we were young.
Thanks. And within that bailiwick, what about incomplete contracts? Maybe we can go straight to that.
Yes. Well, I got interested in incomplete contracts because, the first observation is that many contracts have gaps in them. So an ideal contract, if you think of a situation where two parties are going to be in this economic relationship for maybe many years. So in my work, I give examples, some of which, maybe because I repeat them so much, they seem kind of boring, but they're still perhaps good examples. So a power plant that wants coal is going to burn coal to make electricity, and one thing it could do is site next to a coal mine. It could actually build its power plant next to a coal mine to save on transportation costs. So once you've done that, economists call that a relationship-specific investment, because if I'm the power plant, there could be many coal mines I could site next to. And so you can imagine it's a rather competitive situation. Each of you in this room could have your own coal mine, and I could have you compete for the privilege of having me site next to you. But once one of you's won the competition, it's a bit like my borrow-lender example, then I'm going to site next to you, and then we're locked into each other. Okay, it's kind of one-on-one. And so we're going to have the contract we're going to use the contract to regulate our relationship, which may last for decades. This is actually a real example. Paul Joskow, among others, has studied these relationships, and they go on for 30, 50 or more years. But any contract we write will have gaps in it. So one has to recognize that an ideal contract would have no gaps. It would specify all the aspects of our relationship for the next 30, 50 years, 100 years. But in practice you can't do that because the world is too complicated. It's always changing, as we know. So any contract we write is going to have the feature that things are going to happen during the course of our relationship which we have not been anticipated and put into the contract. And so people call that an incomplete contract. It's got gaps in it.
And going on from that?
Yes, well, going on from that.
Sounds like a dead end if it's incomplete.
It's a dead end. Well, some people probably think it is, but I've spent a lot of time thinking. I got into this with Sandy Grossman when we were trying to understand a classic question in economics, which is what determines the boundaries of the firm. So this is a question that goes back to Ronald Coase in the 30s, and then Oliver Williamson and others have worked on it. The basic question is, let's go back to the power plant and the coal mine. An alternative to that arm's length contractual relationship is to have a merger. The power plant could buy the coal mine, or for that matter, the coal mine could buy the power plant. They could become a single firm and carry out this transaction under the umbrella of one large firm. So a question that is of interest to economists is why do what are the costs and benefits of doing it that way relative to having the arm's length contract? And when we were thinking about it, at some point we realized that the key had to do with the fact that any contract you write is incomplete. And then what matters is who has the right to decide on the things that the contract doesn't specify. So we call those residual control rights or residual decision rights. So an example in this context would be, suppose the contract specified coal, but not in complete detail. So at some future time, it turns out that the power plant, would like low ash content coal, but it wasn't specified in the contract. You could satisfy the terms of the contract by supplying high ash content coal. If the contract had been really complete, it would have nailed down the exact kind of coal, but it didn't. So now who gets to decide that? Well, if you are, if we're separate companies, then Grossman's and my idea was that you, as the owner of the coal mine, have residual control rights over the mine. It's your mine, and so you get to decide what kind of coal is taken out of it, to the extent the contract didn't specify. Whereas if I had purchased your mine back when we started, well, I would have that residual control right. So basically, we developed this theory based on the idea that when contracts are incomplete, who has residual control rights is important, and that residual control rights go with asset ownership. So when you own an asset, it could be a coal mine, it could be a house. And, imagine you rent a house and you don't like the color of the walls in your apartment, your flat, and you want to repaint, or you want to do something perhaps more dramatic. Yet you don't have the right to do that because it's not your house. You would have to go to the landlord and get permission. Now, maybe the landlord would, perhaps you would do a deal. So, by the way, going back to my power plant example, where I want the low ash content coal, if you're a separate coal mine, you can say no to that, but we might renegotiate. So if it's very important for me to get the low ash content coal, I could pay you to do it. But I might have to pay you a lot. I have to persuade you because I don't have the right. I can't impose, I can't insist on it. Whereas in the case where I own the coal mine and you, the manager of the coal mine, are simply an employee, a hired hand, in that case, you have no bargaining power. If I want low ash content coal, well, first of all, I could order you to do it, but even if for some reason you happen to have a particular affection for high ash content coal and you're reluctant to actually do what I want, well, then I could always replace you because you don't have a right, you don't have any right to stay in the mine since it's my mine. So similarly with the landlord, I might persuade the landlord to let me repaint, but maybe I'll have to increase, pay a higher rent or something in return for that.
And could we take that further and say that from that one can develop a theory of property rights in that the costs of hold-up work both ways?
Yeah.
An efficient allocation would be one in which the total costs of hold-up are minimised.
Yes. I mean, what we did was we then developed a sort of simple model of the costs and benefits. So basically, one of the key ideas was that, and this went a bit, sort of was a deviation from the previous literature, that we argued that these residual control rights, there's an optimal allocation of them. It's not always the case that I should have them. It's not always the case you should have them. There are costs and benefits. So back to the power plant and the coal mine. If I'm the power plant, you're the coal mine. If I own your mine, then you can't hold me up. The economists call this the hold-up problem, where I want you to do something. I want the particular kind of coal, but you can say, no, you're going to have to pay me to get it. And you might be able to expropriate a lot of my profit that way. So we call that hold-up. And so if I purchase your mine, I can avoid that hold-up problem. However, that purchase creates another hold-up problem because if I own the mine and you're the manager of the mine, now I can hold you up. How? Well, suppose you had a great idea for how to operate the mine more efficiently. When you own the mine, you could implement that idea and get the returns from it, and there's nothing I could do about it. So that gives you a big incentive to have those efficiency-enhancing ideas. But if you're merely an employee and you have a good idea, well, it's only going to be implemented if I agree. And I could make sure that I get some of the benefits from the idea in return for implementing it. So now you're in a more vulnerable situation as an employee compared to if you'd been an owner. So it cuts both ways.
And that gives you a sense of when it's likely to be integrated or separate?
Yes, at least was a theory, yes. I don't think it's the it's the beginnings of a story. I don't think it's the whole thing, but it's something. Yeah.
Can I just raise a couple of aspects of the theory that are worth talking about, maybe? You mentioned, going back to Coase, the limits to the size of the firm. Coase pointed out the limits of market allocations in terms of transactions cost, but he didn't have a sense of what stopped the firm growing to be the whole economy.
Right, he was a bit feeble on that bit, I thought. At least, I mean, his main argument about why you don't get firms, you don't have firms becoming bigger and bigger, apart from, of course, antitrust authorities might step in, but apart from that, he sort of appealed to the idea that people would make mistakes or something. If I was in charge of a huge firm, then as the boss, I would start to make mistakes, and that would be inefficient. But it's not really terribly convincing, because I could just hire a subordinate to help me. It doesn't really explain why that doesn't happen. Whereas this theory says that the disadvantage of, if I keep on expanding and I acquire your firm, then I am taking residual control rights away from you. You become disempowered, and that's going to have some negative consequences.
You will get your own back.
Yeah.
Can I also ask you about the role of power? I mean, traditional general equilibrium theory that we inherited when we were young, there was no power, essentially.
Right.
Competitive markets. And this line of analysis brings power into market relationships, and that's a major departure.
Yes, it's a very particular kind of power coming from ownership of physical assets. So, by the way, what this theory sort of distinguishes between another element of this theory, which is quite important, is it's all about empowering one party by having them acquire more assets. So the power plant, when I acquire your coal mine, I'm now more empowered in the relationship, and you're less empowered. I can't acquire your human capital. Okay, this theory says we make a distinction between the physical assets like the mine and the human capital of the mine manager. That always stays with you. So, I mean, this is a theory. It's a theory. It says we don't have slavery. So the only things that can be moved around in terms of ownership rights changing hands is physical assets or non-human assets. So one can extend it. It's not just very physical things like coal mines. It could be patents, copyrights, all sorts of intellectual property. They can also be bought and sold and can change the allocation of power. But anyway, yes, the thing is, in general equilibrium theory, there's really no role for it, because we're in frictionless markets. We can move backwards and forwards. People are never locked in. It's always costless for me. If I don't like working with you, I just go back to the competitive market and find somebody else.
And is it possible to give a judgment on which is the more important source of power, contractual lock-in or few sellers, few buyers, traditional monopoly power?
I see, monopoly power. Well,
they could both be important.
Yes, I mean, monopoly power is surely important in some situations, many maybe, but I think of that as a different kind of power. It's the power to charge well above marginal cost. This is a bit closer to the way we normally think of power, in terms of a one-on-one situation where I can get a good outcome because I have all these control rights, I think. But I'm not saying the other one doesn't matter.
And I'd like to turn to your more recent work, where you do change a couple of very important assumptions in the theory as you developed it with Sandy Grossman and John Moore. The central assumptions were the relationship-specific assets and rational egotism, economic self-interest. And many people outside the subject gag on the way we turn in particular to rational egotism as the physics of the gravity of our physics. And you have also, in your work in the last 10 years, moved away from assuming universal rational egotism. Could I ask you to explain that to us?
Yes, well, it turns out that the sort of story that I told you about the power plant and the coal mine and the incomplete contract, and then exposed, when we have to make a decision, it matters who controls what. That story, I mean, it sounds like a reasonable story, but when you go into more detail about why the contract is incomplete and whether far-sighted individuals, if you and I anticipate that things like this are going to happen because we can't write a good contract initially, could we find some clever way around that to overcome the problem? I mean, that's the question that people started asking, which goes under the heading of foundations of incomplete contracts. And it turns out that it's very hard to explain why people can't overcome it. Or to put it another way, there are ingenious mechanisms which come from the mechanism design literature, which I mentioned, and which is also about how we design relationships. It's rather abstract, but it turns out it can be very powerful in certain settings. And in the setting that Grossman, Moore, and I were using, in particular, Eric Maskin and Jean Tirole sort of pointed out that there are ingenious ways of overcoming the incompleteness. So I don't think this is the right place to go into those, but when you see them, you think, surely not, how could that possibly work? At least, yes, I don't think I was the only person who thought that when I first saw it. But it does. However, you can't imagine anybody, I've never met anybody who said, yeah, I can actually see two business people actually employing one of these mechanisms in order to deal with all these unforeseen eventualities. So, but that then raises the question, why not? And that led me to, it was really as a response to that I was forced to entertain the possibility that maybe parties are not 100% rational or not 100% egotistical, or they care about things like fairness, and so very complicated mechanisms for getting them to reveal information they both have, for example, this kind of thing, might not work well because even though the unique Nash equilibrium of these mechanisms would be we both tell the truth, in practice, if I think some other outcome is fairer, I might react negatively if we are forced to reveal the truth. And I might then take it out on you in some other way. So this has led me to analyze the possibility that one can think about a contract in a different way. So my recent work, the last 10 years, has viewed a contract as a reference point. So traditionally, when lawyers think about contracts, I think they think of a contract as all being, it's all about the rights and obligations of the parties. And lawyers sometimes take the view that, when they advise their clients, you want to anticipate all the bad things that can happen and put clauses into the contract which will protect your side from any bad behavior by the other side. So this is another way of saying you want to try to write the most complete contract you can. But I think there's another way of thinking about contracts, which is that one of their roles is to get us on the same page. So it's not really just about rights and obligations. It's a kind of communication mechanism. If you and I agree, let's say you're going to employ me, and we agree on the wage. Okay. Well, one of the reasons we presumably agree on that before there are several reasons why we might agree on it before I start working for you. But one of them is that I've now accepted that as a reasonable wage, and you've accepted it as a reasonable wage, and we've sort of taken something off the bargaining table. If we said, if you said of I'm going to hire you, so show up to work next month, and then we'll talk about your wage. One of the problems there is that might lead to a rather contentious conversation. At the end of it, neither of us might be very happy with the outcome, and we would be starting the relationship on the wrong foot. If we agree on the wage before we get involved, then when each of us has good outside opportunities, then at least that we're not going to argue about that for a while. That's off the table. There might be some other things we will. The nature is, some of the tasks I have to do. There could be some argument about that because that wasn't fully specified. But at least, perhaps the most contentious thing, how much I'm going to be paid, we've agreed on. So this is a view. It may not sound that different but it is rather different. It's thinking of, as I say, of contracts being about avoiding bad feeling later. Because we agreed to, we both think the same thing is reasonable because we agreed to it, and that's going to lead to a better relationship, less bad feeling, more cooperation because neither feels that the other one behaved badly.
And you put an economic mechanism in there in the sense that you can punish me as your employer if I don't treat you what you think.
Yes, the assumption in this version of the theory is that. Going back to the example of the ash content, in the first version, Mark 1 of the theory, the idea was we couldn't specify everything in advance in the contract, but later on, when it turns out I want low ash content coal, well, now we can write a new contract which specifies that, and that is fully enforceable. That's the assumption in that version of the theory. But in the contracts as reference points work, the more recent work, the idea is even ex post, even once we've agreed to low ash content coal, if you're angry, you don't think the outcome, the price I'm paying is fair, you will find ways of getting back at me. And so the ex post contract is not perfectly enforceable. It still relies on some good faith.
You will work to rule.
Yes. And the way you get good faith is by having people feeling that the outcome was fair. And a contract, which you write in advance, is a way of narrowing down the possibilities as to what's fair and what's unfair. So that's what I've been doing. It's a more controversial line of attack because although behavioral economics, so it's very related, all this fairness stuff, anybody who knows about this, there's a huge literature on behavioral economics, which has developed in the last, I don't know how many years, 30, 40, wasn't around when we were, another thing that wasn't around. And some of that is about cognitive limitations that parties have, but some of it is about people caring about fair outcomes. A very famous example is the ultimatum game, where there's £10 to divide, and I get to choose how to divide it, and then you say yes or no. And according to classic game theory, the outcome we would expect is that I would take almost everything for myself, and I'd leave you with 1 penny out of the £10, and you would agree, you would say yes because you prefer 1 penny to nothing. That's the classic solution, if everyone's rational and egotistical. But when people have done this experiment in the lab with all sorts of people, students, but also CEOs, everybody, and it turns out people don't behave that way. I'll take £6 and leave you with 4 or something. Even the dictator game, where you don't even say yes or no, I just make a split and that's it. I won't take everything for myself. So there's a large part of behavioral economics which is trying to understand that behavior, and that's not what I'm doing is not a million miles from that, but somehow it's been a hard sell because the behavioral people aren't very interested in contracts, and the contract people aren't very interested in behavioral. So I still have to find my natural group. But there are some lawyers actually who seem to think it is actually right. it resonates with them, so I'm still somewhat optimistic.
And what about a different way of filling in incompleteness in contracts, which might come more from sociology and the business literatures? The idea that norms and trust can substitute for enforcement, even of, well, particularly of provisions that the incomplete are part of the contract, and that particularly in repeated contracting, game theory could come in very handy here. People can invest in reputations with their contracting partners for being fair-minded and not screwing the other party to the wall.
That's all very important too, and it's particularly, reference. So in the contracts as reference point approach, one doesn't have to argue that the contract is the only reference point. So I'm responding. I'm not, perhaps slightly changing what you said, but norms could have to do with, or customs, with what's happening to other people. So, if we're in a situation where we have to decide something and the contract didn't specify it, we might look to see how other people deal with that, or at how our firm dealt with it in the past. We look at past behaviour as a kind of reference point for what's reasonable. We do that all the time, of course. But we also look at what our our peers are doing. So I think there are many reference points. But I should say
our relationship is potentially a very important one. The history of our relationship.
Yes, the history. I think if you think of institutions, one of the ways. So just to say, institutions. Take King's College, Cambridge. There you think of. In a complete contracting world, Henry VI would have written the Charter of Kings, and it would have specified everything, including what's going to happen today and tomorrow. And of course, that didn't happen. So instead, we have a governance structure, which is like the way the residual control rights are allocated in King's College, Cambridge, is through. I guess the governing body, and also their strange connections with, they used to be with the royal family, but I don't know. Do you still have visitors and things? Or?
Yeah, we have a bishop who visits.
It's extremely complicated, but you have all these decision-making processes, which are a bit like who gets to exercise the residual control rights, and one of the things that politics, these sorts of ideas are relevant for all sorts of situations. The U.S. Constitution is an incomplete contract, and that's why we have things like the Supreme Court to fill in the gaps. But I think precedent. One of the ways institutions can run, work very well is because they have all this history of the way they did things. So, if you come and say, I want to go on leave for 3 years, it'll turn out there's some rule about that, because that's how, and probably because nobody else has ever done that before, you will think, well, it's reasonable that I can't do that. If there was no history to it, then it would be another matter. Maybe you think you should be allowed to do it. So that kind of thing can help to complete contracts in a way that people find acceptable.
It's informal rather than formal.
Yes, it's using reference points from the past.
Yeah. I'm a little concerned that we're being rather technical.
Okay.
So I'd now like to push Oliver towards an application of this analysis that's been very influential to do with public ownership compared to private ownership and public provision of public services rather than contracting out, outsourcing. So the examples you give in your 1997 article range from rubbish collection to national defence through education and health. And you point out that in all these cases the government funds a public service, but the provision decision could be left to a government agency or a private firm, just excluding cooperatives for the sake of simplicity. And the one you focused on was the privatisation of prisons. It's particularly relevant in the UK and the US because in the last 30 years we've seen the creation of many private prisons in both countries. And it's been politically contentious in both countries. Obama has sought to row back on it, and we expect Trump to row forward's probably the wrong way of describing it.
Yeah.
So perhaps I can ask you to explain to us, what does incomplete contract theory contribute to this long-standing contentious issue about nationalisation?
Well, I think it's a useful way of thinking about it, perhaps the only way really to think about it. If, let's say, take the case of prisons, I mean, just to elaborate a little on what Paul just said, I mean, economists love markets, but they also most of them, almost all of them, recognize they have limitations. And when you have externalities, or when it comes to public goods, the government has to be involved. But as you said, just because the government's going to pay for some public service, it doesn't mean that they actually have to provide it themselves. They can procure it. So prisons are an example. We're not going to have prisons arising through the market system. So the government's going to be financing them, but it has this choice to go with a private contractor or to have the prison operated by its own employees. What's the difference? Well, in a complete contracting world, there really wouldn't be a difference, because the contract would specify everything that people are meant to do in all situations that are going to happen. It will be a state in case this wasn't clear. You don't know what's going to happen, but if you know it could be this state of the world or that state of the world, then you write a contingent contract. The employment, so the contract with the private provider would be fully state contingent and would have no gaps. And the contract, if the government chose to do it through its own employees, it could write a complete employment contract with them, specifying exactly what they're meant to do in every state of the world. So these two things would be equivalent. Very hard to escape that conclusion. And so that led us to say, well, okay, so the difference must be important when you can't write a very good contract. And then there is a difference. And we gave the example of, in the case of private prisons, we looked at some of the contracts that the state in the US, so it's often, I think we looked at ones between states of the US, not the federal government, but particular states with private contractors, and the contracts they write are quite elaborate. They have all sorts of stuff about the food that the prisoners should get, and the exercise they should get, and the healthcare they should have access to, and all this sort of thing. But we thought that one thing that was missing, where there was quite a lot of incompleteness, had to do with the how the guards were trained to deal with violent situations, and further, how they should deal with those violent situations. So that suggests that what we were saying wasn't crazy. Then we asked, what are the different incentives of the private prison versus the public prison with respect to this kind of thing? And so one thing you could say is it's all a matter of making money. So a private prison, basically we said that having guards who are not very skilled at dealing with these violent situations, and perhaps under-training them, is going to save you money. So a for-profit prison might have an incentive to do that, whereas a public prison might not. But we went a bit further, actually, because we wanted to connect it to contractual incompleteness. So we said, imagine a situation where the government actually observes a private company hiring inappropriate guards. Well, unless they violated the contract, the government can't actually do anything about it, except it could pay them not to do it. In contrast, if the prison is a public prison, the government can just tell the warden, stop doing that. Please hire better people, you know.
No,
that's the difference. And so we argued that there was a reason to think that this problem of the inappropriate guards and the inappropriate training would be greater in private prisons than public prisons, and that therefore you might expect to see more violence in private prisons than public prisons. And we provided a bit of evidence along those lines, and it turns out, as far as I can tell, there's more evidence in recent years, and that's what led Obama to announce that there would be no more federal private prisons. In fact, you know, when I won the prize, the Financial Times journalist actually wrote in his article that it was because of our paper, which I wish I thought that was true. It was complete news to me. I think he made it up. But anyway, it's not going to happen anyway, right?
The time is running by. I was going to ask you about research methods and topics, in particular maths and law. We've made a particular orientation to maths and law students and
yes.
colleagues.
Yes.
So maybe I'll say a little bit, ask you a little bit about that before going on rather rapidly.
Yeah.
On the maths side, could we say that your research formalizes, as well as extending and changing, previously informal literature on transactions costs, using a lot of maths? And in that sense, maths has been very important in your work. So is that true, and has it changed over time?
Has it changed
in your work over time, the role of maths?
In mine, yeah.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, in this area of incomplete contracts, the previous work was verbal. Coase and Williamson that were the biggest contributors, and they, I mean, Coase, I mean, some of you will know who he was. I mean, he hated mathematics. I mean, he once said to me, I only met him a few times, and on one occasion when I met him, he said, after he'd heard a paper of mine, in fact, the paper with John Moore, he said, if I had known as much mathematics as you, I would have become a chemist. Which I didn't think was a compliment. But he was that kind of person. And actually, another time I met him, and he said, that was, I think I only met him maybe twice. So the second time he said, someday I must get someone to translate your work into English. In fact, by that point I'd written an article for the Columbia Law Review, which was entirely in English. There were no symbols at all. So I pointed that out to him, but I never heard anything about it. Anyway, so he was, yes, Coase, Williamson, very informal. Grossman, Moore, and I tried to, it wasn't that we, I mean, we think in terms of models. The only way, as an economic theorist, I can really understand something. I mean, usually the words are not enough. So you need to be more precise, and that's the role of models. But in this area, the models are not that complicated. It's more conceptual. So it was through trying to model things that we came up with the idea of residual control rights. Once you've said it, somebody might say, why do you need a model for that? Well, maybe you don't, but the point is we never got to that. Without trying to model some other ideas, be precise about them, then we realized they weren't working. So we went backwards and forwards between ideas and models. Eventually we came up with something which we thought actually worked. So that's how I do things. But mathematics has been, in that respect, mathematics has been tremendously important to me because it's just a way of thinking clearly about things. But over time, I've become less and less technical. It's less and less, complicated stuff. It's simple stuff.
second derivatives aren't prominent.
Yeah, right. I've moved to
what's
it's
your
often numerically, often really simple examples almost.
What's your view on the role of maths in economics nowadays, and more generally? There have been a lot of criticisms from undergraduates in America and graduate students about an excessively mathematical curriculum. And I pointed out Paul Romer's stinging critique of mathiness in economics, where at the professional level, many of our colleagues use maths almost, to paraphrase him, as window dressing, to run things past referees and editors, who often don't even read the maths to see there are errors in it. Is there a problem?
Well, I think as you get older, you tend to become more critical of this stuff. I mean, I remember, when I was younger, I thought this was great. The more math, the better. But I don't think that anymore. But I think this debate has always been there. Joan Robinson, I think, once said mathematics is a substitute for thought. And then I heard Terence Gorman once say in response to that, well, thinking is very hard, so maybe that's not such a bad thing. But I do think, certainly in my area, when most of the people who try to do very general things with lots of bells and whistles, it usually doesn't work very well. In some other areas it might, but in the case of contract theory, I think understanding how lawyers think about contracts can be more important than actually a lot of symbols. But some symbols are still useful. It's not as if I still stick to, you need some of it. The question is how much. But the profession, unfortunately, journal editors, and indeed, when you want to get a job, if you have a high-tech paper, it's easier to impress people. It's just one of those things. Even if the topic isn't that interesting, if you show you can do all these things, people think, well, the person must be smart, we should hire them. So I think I'm not sure how to get away, how to solve that problem.
And for the lawyers, you said more than once that lawyers, initially at least, showed more interest in complete contracts than economists did.
Well, I think more in the recent... lawyers always knew that contracts were incomplete. I mean, to them, this was absolutely obvious. I don't think they had really understood about residual control rights and who owns what mattering, because I think lawyers are usually concerned with situations where you have the power plant and the coal mine want to write a contract, and each one has some lawyers to advise them on how to do it, but they don't think about, well, should the power plant buy the coal mine? That's just not. I don't think that's part of their job to think about that. So they haven't thought about it. But I think economists, it's later, it's the more recent work where with the behavioural stuff, where I think at least some lawyers do think that fairness, do think that I mean, I'm working actually with a Swedish lawyer who thinks that lawyers are making a terrible mistake to try to write more and more complicated contracts to protect their client against this kind of bad behavior, that kind of bad behavior. He thinks they should be spending their time trying to kind of develop a good relationship and make sure that, and communicate and sort of think about situations that could arise and how they're going to deal with them, this kind of thing, in a sort of a way that's fair to both parties. Find out what they want to get out of the contract and all this sort of thing, a rather different approach. So that's where I think the lawyers have been more interested, some of them anyway.
I was very pleased to see Klaus Schmidt in writing about incomplete contracts, quoting the German foundation law, the definition of ownership rights. It's almost the same as the one you give in your article. He showed that with delight. That's
not that original after all then, really. But then what is?
It's good enough for most of us.
Yeah.
Could you say a couple of words about your role as a technical expert in cases, in law court cases, where the issue of ownership has been important?
Yes, I was involved in two, so I don't do a lot of this kind of stuff, but I was involved in 2 legal cases, which actually turned out to be, the issues were incredibly close to these theory of the firm issues we've been talking about, boundaries of the firm. So they may sound a bit boring, but they were, in both cases, a firm. In one case it was Black & Decker. They took some of their activities that they were doing in-house, and they spun them out into some separate entity. So in the case of Black & Decker, I think it was healthcare, arranging healthcare benefits for their employees and retirees. So that had been done by human resources inside the company. And then they decided they would create a subsidiary which would do it. So they put all the operations into this subsidiary. Now it turned out to be a wholly owned subsidiary. For reasons that we don't need to get into, there was a huge tax benefit for doing this. And the way the US law is written, to get this tax benefit, you have to show that you have another business purpose. It can't just be for the tax benefit, so there has to be some efficiency reason for doing it. So they said, oh yes, there is, because these people will now be independent. It's a separate firm, and they'll be much more entrepreneurial. So I came along and said, no, that's rubbish, because this new entity is wholly owned by Black & Decker. So in fact, there's been no change in control at all. Residual control rights are still in the hands of Black & Decker. Turned out that the guys who are now doing the same operations, it was the same people. It was exactly the same people who were working on these healthcare benefits. The only difference now was that they were on rather high-powered incentive schemes. So Black & Decker decided they needed to become more efficient, and so they had changed the incentive arrangement. So I said, well, they could have done that, and when they were still employees inside Black & Decker. In that case, though, they wouldn't have got this tax benefit. And anyway, so I basically said it was still one firm, really, in terms of control, and the case was settled. We didn't win. But then there was a second case where Wells Fargo did something similar with its real estate operation. So Wells Fargo is a big bank. Turns out it owns a lot of property because it keeps on merging with other banks, and then it doesn't need all the, it's streamlining the operation. So they have a lot of excess property, which they then lease out. And they decided, we'll have the people doing this, we'll put into a separate entity. And again, there was a great big tax benefit. Again, they retained complete control of the new entity. So I was again able to argue that it was just cosmetic. This time, the case was not settled, and we actually won it. So I had to explain the theory of the firm to a federal judge, which was a challenge. Well, he looked kind of sleepy during that time. He might have been sleeping, but some of his law clerks, I think, were awake, and so it seemed to work.
Let me use maybe a few minutes at the end there to ask you a few aspects of your personal experiences. Starting with your career decisions, 2 are very striking, possibly interesting to many members in the room. You switched from maths to economics after your BA, and then you switched from the UK to the US 3 years after that, going to Princeton for your PhD. Can you tell us a little about both of those decisions and whether you think they were good moves?
Well, I certainly think they were good moves, yes. I mean, maths to economics was, I was a mediocre mathematician, as Ken Moody, somewhere here, can testify to that. I could tell I liked mathematics, but I could see rather quickly there were people who were far better. I wasn't going to have a career in mathematics. It was 1969 when I graduated, and it was a time of student revolution and the like, and I didn't. The idea of a real job was unattractive. And I had heard that people were using mathematics in economics, One of the people, actually, who I had a conversation with about that was Bob Rothwell, who had also started off in mathematics. And the other thing actually was that I liked to engage in political argument at the time, and I found everything was going quite well until someone, the other person on the other side, raised some issue like the balance of payments, and I had no idea what they were talking about. So I lost the argument at that point. I thought I should learn something about this subject. So these were my motivations. So I went to Warwick, where I did a 2-year master's degree, 1 year sort of transition, learning some of the undergraduate stuff, and then the second year, the master's degree, the real one. After that, going to Princeton was really because one of the professors at Warwick, John Williamson, who had been a graduate student at Princeton, and it seemed pretty clear at the time that that was the place to do graduate work, the US. I mean, there were some, LSE would have been a possibility. There were some possibilities in the UK, but I think the US scene was better.
There was funding to do it at that time.
There was funding too, yes. But I think the main thing was there were other people doing the same. There was a bigger group of people doing their PhDs along with you, and that was good.
Can I turn to King's College when you were an undergraduate?
Yeah.
In the 1960s, you were a contemporary of Tony Judd, who will be familiar to many people in this room.
Yeah.
Became a professor of political science and European history at New York University and died a few years ago. Wrote a book of memoir essays before he died. One of them is called Meritocrats, about kings in the mid-1960s. So both you and Tony came up in 1966.
Yeah.
Tony found himself, as he says, part of the transitional generation in the college that changed suddenly from a late Victorian ethos of privilege, culture and social self-confidence to grammar school comprehensive meritocracy destined for careers in public service rather than private profit. Unfortunately, he feels the place went to the dogs thereafter. But I wonder if you would describe your recollection, your impression of the place at that time, and how you see it in retrospect.
I think what Tony says is very interesting to be, but I'm not sure I was really aware of it quite the way he was. I think maybe later, as you look, I see it everywhere. If you look at the Harvard Economics Department now and compare it to what it would have looked like in the 60s, it's radically different. There are many, we have at least now some women, not enough, but we have some, and we have many non-Americans, including myself. Well, I'm an American, I'm a dual national, but people who come from somewhere else. There were always one or two like that, but it's very, I think it would be dominated by Americans, white American men, okay, and that's changed. And so that's, something similar, we're talking about something similar here, I think. Exactly when that happened, I don't know, but it's been a gradual process.
Thanks.
And probably a very good one.
I was going to go on to the Faculty of Economics and Politics, but time has run out.
Oh,
perhaps.
I would have said a few words about that.
So let me now ask members of the audience to make comments or questions. We probably have only 10 minutes, I'm afraid.
Oliver, tell us about the Faculty of Economics and Politics.
The Faculty of Economics. I'm glad you asked that question. It was there are people here who know it very well. It was a complicated place. It was an interesting place. I will always say it was, I think, the years 75 to 81, when I was on the faculty, were some of the most interesting years of my intellectual life. That was, largely because of Frank Hahn, who, even though we had all this fighting between the different schools, Frank managed to assemble a small but superb group of economic theorists around him, like David Newbury, Roger Whitcomb's here. And then there were visitors. You know, he had this, he managed to get this Quaker project, as he called it, through the SS, I think the Social Science Research Council or something. And we were able to have people like Douglas Gale, I guess he was a junior research fellow, Eric Maskin, David Krebs, people like that, others. So it was very lively. I didn't like the fact that there were all these other people who, you know, with whom it was very hard to have a good discussion of economics because they had a totally different view. And we couldn't get, it was always a big fight to get good appointments. And typically what you had to do was, you know, if your group wanted an appointment, there had to be a second appointment for the other group. And that's not a very good way of building a faculty. So, so that was a problem.
It's interesting you found it so stimulating.
Yes, because people talk to each other a lot about what they were doing. And I think in a way, I think say at Harvard it's very professional. You go to your own particular specialized seminar and you may not really talk much about economics more generally.
We did have a coffee room.
We had a coffee room where people insulted each other. But there was also talk about economics, yes.
Other comments or questions? David.
One of the distinctive things about Cambridge is the college, especially for the fellowship. How do you find that in the United States?
Well, it's interesting. I think I don't think I was a natural college person because I was the trade-off. Do you mean at the faculty level or at the student level?
At the faculty level.
At the faculty level. Well, I think the trade-off again. If I think of my colleagues at Harvard, you know, they are dedicated. They seem to dedicate, 23 out of 24 hours of their day to writing articles for publication in economic journals, and they don't have much time for anything else. Here, I think, you do some of that, but you also go and have lunch in the college or whatever, and you talk to other people. My own view is that when I was younger, maybe the American system was appealing to me. As I get older, I wouldn't mind having a few more conversations, a general conversation. So it's a trade-off.
The faculty club isn't a good substitute.
No one goes there anyway. That's really true. I mean, the only people who go there are old people. And by old, I mean older than me.
Yes.
So, if I understood you correctly, we're sort of working from the premise that when we're writing the contract, we both think it's fair, and then some situation arises which might change the picture. But I was wondering whether that is really always the case. So, say if you're my landlord here in Cambridge, and you can offer me pretty much any contract that you want, and I very likely take it because it's hard to find a house. So, don't we then need in that situation a third body, say the government or a watchdog, to make sure that actually we really get a fair contract, and how would you put that into the theory?
Well, in my work, I've tended to take the view that when we start, there's a sort of competitive situation. So if you take the example of you and your landlord, you could go to many landlords. There's some sort of market out there, and you could look at the prices in that market, and so I'm just talking about in my work I've tended to assume that people think the market price is fair because it was, you don't blame any particular person for the market price. And so, the rent may be high, but that's what everybody else is paying. You don't expect the landlord to do you a favor by charging you a much lower rent. That would be like a kind of charitable contribution. You don't expect that. You don't feel entitled to that. And so it's only later in the relationship when you're one-on-one where it's costly to return to the market. At that point, the landlord can be discretionary in certain ways, and then you might think his or her actions are unfair. Now, not everybody thinks that what this assumption is right. So some people think that just because something is determined in a market setting, it doesn't make it fair, which is maybe what I hear you say. I think we don't know enough about that. In some experiments that I've done with Ernst Fehr, Klaus Schmidt, we did actually find that, it was in the lab, but these were experiments where you did have a competition ex ante. So we had a buyer, and there were two sellers competing for a contract with a buyer, and it was rather cutthroat competition. So the price the winning seller got was quite low because of this competition from the other seller. And it turned out we did some sort of, we allowed the seller then to punish the buyer later on, which presumably at some small cost to himself. So, if you thought it was unfair, you might take it out on me. But it turned out people didn't do that. They seemed to think that was okay because it was an arm's length deal. But I'm sure there are other settings where it's not true. I'm not sure whether you need third parties. You may need, maybe as the landlord, if I'm worried about this, I might offer you a better deal, just because I want you not to be angry with me later on. But who knows?
One more question.
Just related to that question and math modeling economics, because when we state a model, the conclusions of the model are only true if all the assumptions are true. But when we see these cases, it ends up also being an incomplete contract in the source. We do some assumptions, but there are also many missing gaps. And the way we fill the gaps of the math is with rhetorics. Oh, this might work in this situation, maybe this work in that, and then we focus on the storytelling. So my question is, if at the end of the day, the one that fills the gaps is the storytelling, what is the added value of the math if we can also develop all the rhetorical argument independent of it?
I didn't fully hear it.
No, I had trouble.
Did you have? Could you just? Could you speak?
A lot of the incompleteness in the contract is covered up with storytelling and rhetoric. And if that's so important,
In the analysis?
In the reality.
Oh.
Reality.
Yeah.
So where does the maths come in relation to that? I think that's
So maybe repeat.
Could you stand up? Then I could hear you better.
Sorry. No, my question was with the math assumptions, because when we do math modeling, the result of the model is true when the assumptions are true.
Yes.
On the other spaces, we cannot conclude anything. But because we have limited space to write the assumptions, there are many gaps that we cannot fill. And we use rhetorics to argue why the remainder part can be still valid. So we say, oh, maybe in that particular case, the math does not apply, but we can try to generalize it in one way or in another. And my question is, at the end of the day, the one that drives is the storytelling. So what is the added value that the math gives?
This sounds like a comment about all of economics, right? It's not just about, isn't it? I mean, you could say, if you're a macroeconomist, you write down a model, but then, when the government, the Prime Minister or the President calls you up and says, what should I do? You don't necessarily apply that model. You might, you think more generally. But that's life. I mean, I think the model can still inform, it can still be helpful. It helps you to understand more complicated situations that the model doesn't apply to. In other words, I think that you end up with the rhetoric, as you call it, will be better rhetoric because there was a model somewhere.
Okay, I think we'll leave that one right there.
I think that's my answer.
Apologise to the audience for not having given you more time to ask questions. I apologise to myself for having come with too many questions myself. And let me thank Oliver warmly for giving us such an interesting session.